I don't think I have to explain who the two guys at the head of the table are. You likely all know Darth Vader, the Emperor's enforcer, and Wilhof Tarkin, perhaps the Empire's most powerful Grand Moff. But who were the others at the table? And why were they important enough to be seated there? Since A New Hope is now nearly 50 years old, and given that every background glubshitto character in Star Wars gets a backstory, we have access to a sometimes absurd amount of information about them. Information that is surprisingly far more interesting than I realized before researching this video. And why were there other empty chairs at that meeting on the Death Star? Who were they for? We'll take a look at that in a moment. But let's start with these two, the ones with significant speaking roles who get into an argument early on. They are Conan Antonio Motti and Cassio Taggy. Cassio Taggy was a scion of the super wealthy Taggy family from the Tepazi sector. They owned the massive Taggy Corporation, which was active in mining and manufactured droids and weapons, among other things. An absolutely wild family. This gave Taggy a foot in the door to the Empire's highest ranks. He was able to leverage this to such an extent that he became one of the most powerful Imperial figures of all. In the old Legends continuity, this earned him the role of head of the Imperial military forces stationed on the Death Star. That meant he was the one in charge of the security personnel and stormtroopers responsible for protecting the Death Star and carrying out potential landing or boarding operations launched from the station. In the new canon, however, Taggy was even more powerful. Here he became the overall head of the Imperial military, galaxy-wide. So when it came to the training of stormtroopers, their deployment, the strength of ground forces, or any ground operations, Taggy was the boss. In principle, he answered only to Palpatine. Motti was Taggy's exact counterpart. He too came from a very wealthy and influential family from Cezuena. In Legends, he was in charge of the Death Star's fleet operations. He oversaw all the Star Destroyers and TIE Fighters assigned or slated to be assigned to the Death Star. This made him, along with Taggy, one of the highest-ranking figures directly beneath Tarkin. Much like Taggy, Motti's role in the new canon went beyond just the Death Star's fleet. He was a naval chief, the head of all Imperial fleet operations. Both have really interesting backstories. The problem is, they don't really make much sense in the context of this movie. Taggy complains to Motti that they are in danger as long as the Death Star isn't fully operational, because the rebels are stronger than everyone thinks. And Motti, the head of the Imperial fleet, replies that the rebels pose a threat only to Taggy's ships, not the Death Star itself. But Taggy is the commander of the ground forces, not of the fleet. That's Motti's department. So it should be the other way around. The only explanation I can think of is this. Since ground units have to be deployed to various planets, they need to be transported there by spacecraft, and that journey could be dangerous for Taggy's troops and therefore for Taggy's ships. Still, it would have made more sense to me the other way around. Do you have any other explanations for this? But those two aren't the only interesting ones. There are several other very important people sitting at that table too. One you might recognize is this guy, Wolf Yularen. He played a role as a Republic admiral in the Clone Wars. Interestingly, his backstory aligns across both continuities in its key aspects. We learn here that Yularen had already served as an intelligence officer for the Republic, but decided to work as a fleet officer during the Clone Wars, only to step down from fleet duty upon the Empire's founding and return to intelligence operations. Among the Empire's various intelligence agencies, he chose the domestic branch, the ISB, where he was tasked with uncovering and rooting out treasonous activities within the Senate. He performed this role so effectively that he steadily rose through the ranks over the years, eventually being promoted to director of the ISB. That promotion earned him a seat at this table. After all, the Death Star was intended to be the ultimate weapon against the rebellion. It was the final piece of the puzzle needed to defeat the rebels once and for all, a plan that could only succeed if the Death Star could locate every rebel stronghold, a task requiring intelligence data. This guy here is Trek Moloch, another general about whom we learn little in the current canon. In Legends, however, he was said to be Taggy's right-hand man, which earned him a seat at the table. Another figure who served essentially as a right-hand man was Cyward Cass. He had served for years as a major in the Imperial ground forces, before coming into contact with Grand Moff Tarkin, who hired him as an aide long before the Death Star project. Yet he apparently secured a seat at this meeting in his capacity as Tarkin's aide. This man, Murad Manbast, was also one of Tarkin's aides, but held a more significant role as well. He was the chief manager of the Death Star, effectively the ship's captain. He handled the tedious day-to-day operations and maintained control over the station whenever Tarkin wasn't personally issuing commands. But the most hardcore of them all was probably this guy, Hurst Romodi. In Legends, we learn that he joined the Republic during the Clone Wars and was one of the first non-clones and non-Jedi to command clone ground forces. A highly successful veteran of the Clone Wars, he remained loyal to the Empire. Shortly after its founding, he was tasked with wiping out separatist holdouts in the galaxy's western regions. Romodi spent 2 years on this mission, eventually losing his eyesight and suffering severe facial injuries during a pirate raid. Yet instead of being shipped back to the core worlds, he insisted, after a brief stint in a Bacta tank, on continuing the fight for his empire. He subsequently underwent top-tier surgery and received cybernetic eyes. This campaign in the Western Galaxy secured 8 sectors and countless planets for the Empire, while earning Romodi considerable renown. This fame helped him land a seat in the Senate after his military career ended, and he made such a name for himself there that Tarkin personally wanted him as an aide. His story is similar in canon, though he didn't enter the Senate after his military career. Instead, he simply retired, only to be brought back into service by Tarkin, who needed help completing the Death Star. And canon has embraced Romodi even further. Given his close association with Tarkin, he appeared alongside him on Eriadu during the Bad Batch Season 2 finale, and again on the Death Star in Rogue One. Interestingly, Romodi survived the destruction of the Death Star, presumably because he had left the station shortly beforehand, though the exact details aren't specified. But he's not the only one in this regard. Taggy also survived because he had been tasked with investigating Princess Leia's claims about a rebel base on Dantooine, and as a result was not present on the Death Star in time for the final battle over Yavin. So that accounts for the members who were present, but we can also see that 3 chairs are empty. That means 3 people are missing who would otherwise have had a seat there. Who could they be? One person is relatively obvious. I think Orson Krennic. He was the actual head of the Death Star program. He oversaw its research and production. He certainly would have had a seat at the table. Had his own Death Star not killed him on Scarif. That leaves 2 chairs empty. Another person who would fit perfectly here is Armand Isard. The name probably doesn't ring a bell for many of you, but Wolf Yularen of the ISB is sitting right there. In both the Legends and the current canon, Isard headed the Imperial Intelligence Agency's sister organization, essentially the Foreign Intelligence Service, which is actually mentioned in Andor. And then there's a 3rd chair. Who is this for? My guess? Tarkin. Yes, he does have a chair here. He sits in the only one with a higher backrest than the others. But I suspect that this bigger chair wasn't originally intended for Tarkin. It was likely meant for Grand Vizier Maz Ameda, or even more likely, the Emperor himself. After all, the Death Star was supposed to be the ultimate weapon of the Empire. Of the Emperor, not Tarkin's ultimate weapon. Other mighty weapons of the Empire were the big Star Destroyers. If you want to learn more about them, watch my 50 facts video about Star Destroyers, about their weaponry, hangar capacity, other models and more. With that, I wish you all a great day and may the Force be with you.